In this video, we're going to talk about comma rules for comma rule number 4. In your grammar books, it's on page 61, so you can turn to there if you would like to follow along as we go through this. So to start, I just want you to take a second and read through these 4 sentences. And what I'd like you to do is I want you to think about what do you notice about the comma usage in the following 4 sentences. So go ahead and pause the video, read through those sentences, and note what you notice. Okay, so hopefully, when you pause the video and you read through these sentences, you started to notice that the comma is separating this first section of the sentence from the second section. This first section of the sentence is considered a dependent clause. So what that means is that it cannot stand on its own. So we can see here, before they started the test, although it has a subject and a verb, it doesn't have a complete thought. We don't know what they did before they started the test. At the beginning of the concert, same concept. We don't know what happened. It's because it's not a complete thought. It's not a complete sentence. Hoping to improve his grade, what did we do? We're not sure. We have to see the second part of the sentence. And to pass the test, same thing there as well. So if we look at the second half of each of these sentences, we can see that these can stand alone. The students sharpen their pencils. That is an independent clause. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it has a complete thought. So that could be a sentence on its own. And we would see that in these same 3 sentences, or the next 3 sentences as well. So what that means is that our commas, what we're going to talk about today, is commas that separate a dependent clause at the start of a sentence versus an independent clause in the second part of the sentence. The comma rules 4a through d on page 61 are as follows. So you use a comma after a dependent element introduces an independent clause, just like we saw in those previous sentences. So we use a comma after introductory dependent clauses. So you can see in your book, if you note on page 61, they're the common dependent clause starters. After, although, as if, in order, whenever. There's a giant list there, so I'd recommend you look in your book on page 61, and you'll see a list of those common dependent clause starters. So when we see one of those words at the start of a sentence, one of those words or phrases at the start of a sentence, we should know, okay, we might be having an introductory dependent clause here, so I need to pay attention. So that might be after she won the race, comma, Katie celebrated with her teammates, just like we saw in sentence 1 on the previous slide. The next example is that we would use a comma after 2 or more introductory prepositional phrases. So for a list of common prepositional phrases, you should see page 17 in your grammar book. But this means things like at the beginning of the concert. Okay, so at the beginning, that's a prepositional phrase. Of the concert is a prepositional phrase. So we would put a comma, and then the conductor spoke to the audience. So note here, guys, there has to be 2 or more introductory prepositional phrases for that to happen. They also have to be more than 4 words. 4 words or more in order to put a comma there, but we'll look at an example of that in a minute. After an introductory, so the next rule in this is that you need to use a comma after an introductory verb ending in ing or ed that acts like an adjective. The technical term for this is a participle phrase. So that means when we say things like, frightened by her poor performance on the last exam, comma, Maya studied diligently for the next test. So you'll notice we have that verb acting as an adjective instead of a noun. So after we have an ing or an ed verb that starts a sentence, we know that we're probably going to have to use a comma there to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause. And then finally, we want to use a comma after an introductory infinitive phrase. So if you take a foreign language, you know that if a verb is in the infinitive state, that means it hasn't been conjugated yet. So if you start a sentence with to and then a verb, so for example, to pass the test, comma, I have to study. When you start it with that to and then a verb, you know that you're going to probably have to use a comma after that. So you can see here's our shortcut for it. So just DC, comma, IC. When you start it with a dependent clause, you'll want a comma to separate it from the independent clause. So let's take some time to practice. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and read through each of these sentences. So pause the video, read through the sentences, and decide where you want to put a comma in each of these sentences, or some of the sentences might not need a comma. Okay, so now hopefully you paused the video and you took some time to fix each of these sentences if they needed fixing. So let's take a look at these here. Okay, as soon as Winston had dealt with each of the messages, he clipped his corrections to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the basket. So we would need a comma right here, and that's because our sentence starts with as soon as. That is one of our introductory dependent clause starters. Okay, so that's in our list. And we can see I knew to separate it, this first half from the second half, because he clipped his corrections to the appropriate copy of the Times and pushed them into the basket. That is an independent clause that can stand on its own, whereas the first part of that sentence cannot. So I need to put a comma there to separate it. So go to the next sentence. After the difficult test, my teacher asked students to ask questions and come see her for help. So after the difficult test, so that again is using one of those dependent clause starters, after the difficult test. And it is, you can see, more than 4 words. So we know, or excuse me, it's 4 words or more. So you know we're going to use a comma there. So I would put the comma right here, and I can test it again by checking, would this second half of the sentence stand on its own? My teacher asked students to ask questions and come see her for help. Yes, that can stand on its own, so we clearly have a dependent clause and an independent clause separated by a comma. Let's look at the next sentence. We were able to go to school after we decided to wear masks. So I see here that the after, that dependent clause phrase, comes right here. And although we were able to go to school, that can stand on its own, and this second half is a dependent clause. This isn't introducing the independent clause because it comes second. So this sentence is already correct, so it does not need a comma. The next sentence says, wrenching his body out of bed, Winston prepared for the exercises. So I notice here that we're starting this sentence with that participle, with that word ending in an ing. Wrenching his body out of bed, so I know that I'm going to need a dependent clause, so I'm going to put that right, the comma right here, because it starts with that dependent clause. Winston prepared for the exercises can stand on its own, so we want to separate those. To perform his exercises, Winston must wake up at 7:15. So this is that infinitive phrase, so I notice to perform his exercises, we're going to need a comma right here, because if we see Winston must wake up at 7:15, that can stand on its own, but this right at the beginning cannot, and I know that it is a dependent clause starter, or excuse me, it's a participle phrase or an infinitive phrase because it says to perform his exercises. And lastly, while Tom talked on the phone with his Myrtle, Jordan and Nick listened at the dinner table. While is one of those kind of signal words that we're entering a dependent clause. So while Tom talked on the phone with his Myrtle, Jordan and Nick listened at the dinner table. So this is an independent clause, whereas this is a dependent clause, so we need the comma to separate them there. Okay, so hopefully now you have a better idea of how to use commas when you're working with introductory dependent clauses.